Welcome to Burford all those years ago, and welcome to part 2 of my virtual walking tour, which is entitled The Old Stage Road Along the Detroit Trail. Today our tour will take us down a 35-kilometer or 22-mile stretch of a longer former portage route which I had outlined in part 1. This section became known as the Old Stage Road. We will be starting at a place east of the present-day town of Ingersoll, at a little hamlet called Centerville, along the Beachville Road. So get your comfortable footwear on, and a hat if you would like, and follow me on the Old Stage Road along the Detroit Trail. In part 1, we left off after I had introduced Governor John Graves Simcoe and his expeditionary party, consisting of some 24 men, including servants and Mohawk guides, and several dignitaries who went on to become some of Upper Canada's future top brass. In this segment, part 2, and in part 3, we will be continuing to look at the history of the Old Stage Road as it evolved as a result of 3 major upgrades, from a footpath in the 18th century to a settler's trail in 1797 to a military highway in 1810 and finally to a stagecoach road in 1828. We will be starting at a place between Ingersoll and Beachville, Ontario, approximately where the original trail crossed the Thames River over 200 years ago. Then following the 19th century stagecoach road through West and East Oxford and then into Brant County in the former township of Burford, ending this segment at the West Quarter town line at the Stage Road. But first I will provide just a bit more background information in order to understand or visualize the way it was here over 200 years ago. I will briefly describe the governor's mode of travel, the weather conditions they faced, the conditions of the trail itself, their accommodation, and their diet. The governor and his men set out on their return trip from Detroit, February 23, 1793, in 16 carryalls, or sleighs. Because the traveling was so good, and the trail was much better, there was a good dumping of snow, and it froze so hard that they could walk on the frozen Thames River, as it was easier traveling that way. By the way, a carryall, or carryall spelt with 2 R's, is either a light 4-wheeled, open or covered 1-horse carriage, or a small, narrow, open 1-horse sleigh for 1 person only. Since the river was frozen hard, both horses and carryalls were okay to ride on the frozen river. That is how cold it was, at least for a short time. The trail became treacherous, narrow, and with such radical changes in elevation, having the carryalls, or that many horses, would have just slowed them down. So they left the horses and carryalls and went on foot, but with a couple pack horses. Some of the men had snowshoes. However, the governor only wore moccasins. They traveled much of their journey on foot. By the night of March 4th, 1793, it poured rain, and there was a severe thunder and lightning storm. Their bedding material, consisting of boughs of hemlock, was soaked right through, right from the start. But what's new? Welcome to Ontario, Mr. Simcoe. Their camp for the night of March 4th was on the north side of the Thames River, opposite what is now Centreville. The landscape in this area today has been completely removed by extensive quarrying. According to Major Littlehell's journal of the trip, they usually stopped at about 4 p.m. to allow the native guides to construct wigwams. Since these wigwams were only large enough for about a half a dozen men or so, they probably needed several of these built for such a crowd. Major Littlehell's describes how they were constructed in his journal. The dexterity and alacrity of these people, habituated to the hardships incidental to the woods, is remarkable. Small parties will, with the utmost facility, cut down large trees with their tomahawks, bark them, and in a few minutes construct a most comfortable hut, capable of resisting any inclemency of weather, covering it with the bark of the elm. As far as food was concerned, their diet for the trip consisted of salt pork, venison, if they were lucky, and venison soup and biscuit, or hardtack, as it was called. However, they also ate raccoons and porcupines, which were plentiful around here at that time. Bears, wolves, cougars, and rattlesnakes were also plentiful here back then. It is interesting to note that along their way, prior to reaching their March 4th stopover, they had also encountered various totems at sacred burial sites and deer fences and carvings and drawings made with charcoal and vermilion on the trunks of trees. At one location, a tree carving depicted men with the heads of deer, and at another location, a tree had the carving of what looked like a cat or perhaps a cougar, but they also saw drawings depicting men hunting bison, which you wouldn't expect to see around here. Lake Erie was named after the indigenous tribe known as the Erie, or the Cat Nation. These were Iroquoian, and it is possible that the carving of the cat had something to do with them and their former territory. Just west of the present-day Folden's Line Bridge is the approximate location where the Simcoe expedition crossed the Thames River on logs or fallen trees to the south side. In Major Littlehell's journal of the trip, he said that it had rained without intermission and that brooks and rivulets were swollen considerably. They crossed many of these watercourses on the trunks of fallen trees or logs. After crossing the main southeast branch of the Thames, which passes through what is now Woodstock, Beachville, Centreville, and Ingersoll, they still had many, many more creeks, streams, and flooded swales or runs of water to cross, as there were no bridges. The Thames isn't such a wide river compared to the Grand River, but it could still be tricky trying to cross when it was extremely flooded. The original Thames River was a natural, meandering, and navigable watercourse through what is now the Beachville area. However, over the past 150 years, limestone quarrying in the Beachville area, along with flood control measures, called for modifications and channelization of the natural river course. Along the shore of this section of the upper Thames River, the early European settlers found limestone, and it became a significant resource here. Basically, the river in the vicinity of Beachville and Centreville is a completely different configuration than what the early settlers and Simcoe would have known. Note, the Simcoe party may not have crossed the larger rivers in the same place, coming back from Detroit, as they did when they went to Detroit, as unpredictable weather conditions and the water elevation at the time of crossing played a big role in deciding where and how to cross. This is why the place where they crossed and the place where the local settlers later established a fording place were roughly about 1,800 meters or 5,900 feet apart, according to land surveyors. One thing about fording a river back in those days, before there were bridges, is that usually in order to get wagons down to the river ford, they required a natural slope that wasn't too steep, and the same on the opposite side of the river. Since they didn't do very much in the way of earthworks to accomplish this, this was done by selecting a fording site near or adjacent to the mouth of a stream or creek that had fairly uniform side slopes, so they could just gradually climb the gradual slope all the way up the stream from the river. The hill, or Ingersoll Moraine as it is known, which runs parallel to the river along the south side of the Thames at Beachville, seems way too steep in most places for wagons or stagecoaches to travel up or down. This is also probably the reason why the governor's party did not try going straight up the hill soon after they crossed the river. They gradually climbed the slope further along the hill, skirting the more severe slopes, and finally reaching the plateau near Dorland. With this information and my knowledge of early land surveying, cartography, and of course physiography, from dear Mr. Harry Southam's high school geography class, I can deduce the likely route of the trail as it may have ascended and descended this moraine. This is a view of the present-day village of Beachville. The orange dashed line represents the approximate route taken by Simcoe's group, based on the highly detailed notes of D.W. Smith, who accompanied the governor on that expedition. My interpretation of the land features noted by Smith are transposed onto 21st century mapping, which has been produced by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and the Oxford County GIS website. Just prior to the survey of Oxford on the Thames, as it was being called, the trail which brought the settlers into the interior of the province was improved by a group of settlers under the leadership of Thomas Ingersoll between 1795 and 1797. But more about Thomas Ingersoll later in Part 3. If you look at the mapping that was done by the early surveyors of the late 18th century in this area, the trail was shown as a dotted line which appears to cross the Thames River somewhere between lots 9 and 10 of the Broken Front concession in West Oxford on the Thames. Immediately after crossing the Thames River, the Simcoe party then crossed 2 more runs of water, and at 9:40 in the morning of March 5th, they met the Winter Express, which was the bi-weekly courier en route between Niagara and Detroit. This express consisted of 3 men on foot. The land surveyor, Augustus Jones, was with them, and instead of going on to Detroit, Jones joined the Simcoe throng and went back to Niagara. The courier, or express, came through by way of the footpath every 14 days, and since this was roughly the amount of time it took to travel between Niagara and Detroit, the Simcoe party also met the express when they were heading to Detroit as well. A few more creeks and streams and runs of water, then they cross what is now Cedar Creek, which is a very distinct or unmistakable physical feature along this route, which helps us piece together this very intricate puzzle. D.W. Smith describes it as a large brook running to the left and making a fork to the northward with the River Thames. As you can see, Cedar Creek runs north into the Thames, but before it gets there, it makes several forks along the way, just as D.W. Smith had described. Further along, you will see that most of the water courses here on out run into the Grand River and run to the right of the road. There are still cedar groves in the area as well, along the old stage road in Oxford County. However, the British called them cypress. According to Major Littlehales, at 12:23 p.m., March 5th, they halted in a cypress or cedar grove, where they were much amused by seeing Captain Joseph Brant and some of his men chase a lynx with their dogs and rifle guns. But they did not catch it, according to Littlehales. At 1:55 p.m., they arrived at what is the upper end of what is now called Kenny Creek, which runs into the Grand River eventually. They found it very much flooded and noted it was a mudhole creek. Kenny Creek starts basically in the middle of East Oxford-on-Thames and flows east into the county of Brant, a short distance from the hamlet of Cathcart. Here, east of Cathcart, it merges with Horner Creek, Elliott Drain, and Whiteman's Creek, and eventually flows into the Grand River. You will see a quote in my credits in this film, which is one of my favorite quotes, and it goes, "The past actually happened, but history is only what someone wrote down," by Whitney Brown. I think it is fantastic that we have two versions of the same expedition. One by D.W. Smith, with very accurate data, which records the very locations of the land features they encountered, and the other from the standpoint of a diarist in the person of Major Littlehales. Smith's details coincide very accurately with today's mapping, but he does not elaborate on what is going on in and around the expedition party itself. Between what is now Vandecar in Oxford County and the Burford West Quarter Town Line Road, Major Littlehales mentions in his journal, on their way to Detroit, February 12th, "We traveled through an irregular woody country and passed an encampment said to have been Lord Edward Fitzgerald's when on his march to Detroit, Michilimackinac, and the Mississippi." This is very interesting that D.W. Smith does not mention this in his journal. How Littlehales comes to know this fact is not known, but Dr. Henry Scadding of Toronto, who published Littlehales' journals in 1889, says, "This refers to, no doubt, an incident in Lord Fitzgerald's journey through Canada in 1789. This is where the name of one of the most colorful historical characters that had ever traveled through Burford enters into this story, but only briefly. Only a few months earlier, in 1792, Fitzgerald had been dismissed from the British Army for publicly saying that he agrees with the speedy abolition of all hereditary titles and feudal distinctions. That was not a good thing to say, and he was a very brave fellow, I'd say. I will elaborate on Lord Edward Fitzgerald and his very colorful and exciting story in Part 3. At 3:15 p.m., the Simcoe expedition passed the place where they had encamped on the night of February 11th, when on their way to Detroit. It was described as being close on a small swampy spot with long coarse grass. This location, in the geographic township of Burford, is about 600 meters west of the West Quarter Town Line Road, where the road overlooks a small swampy spot that to this day still has long coarse grass.